Thank you for joining us today and for your interest in the International Peace Arch. Even though I've passed it thousands of times, I had never attempted to do any research on the topic. When we first envisioned a virtual field trip, I envisioned we'd be walking around the gardens, looking at the plaques, walking through the arch. But when the provincial park closed in June of 2020 and has remained closed, we had to change the format. I had to take what seemed like a pretty deep dive into historical research to prepare an illustrated lecture. My starting point was a book by Richard Clark of Blaine called Sam Hill's Peace Arch, Remembrance of Dreams Past. Not only reminded me and prompted me the dates and timelines of the construction, but also the reason why the Peace Arch was built to begin with. I supplemented this with historical research in newspapers, Surrey Archives, White Rock Museum and Archives, and the generosity of individuals who shared their expertise and connections. As you can see, we're not at the Peace Arch, but I thought this would be a perfect starting point for a trip back in time. The Annandale School was built in 1891 in the Port Kells area and moved to this site at the museum in 2019. It is one of Surrey's most treasured heritage structures. Doing my research, I discovered that the story of the building of the arch seems to contain what might be considered myths or legends, or at least some subjective facts. One of the challenges of researching the story is that it was the dream of one man, not a commissioned monument, with records residing in a designated repository. I'm going to warn you that you may tire of the phrase centennial celebration. Not only were we hoping to celebrate one this year, but there are at least 2 earlier centennials relating to the eventual opening of the arch. This is the majestic monument you're used to seeing in a beautiful landscape setting. When it was constructed in 1921, it was a very different looking place. Not exactly stately and elegant, it stood on semi-swampy ground in the middle of occupied shanty houses and very near a somewhat seedy hotel called the St. Leonard. While many will know the Peace Arch as a busy border crossing and that it sits on the longest undefended border in the world, it also has the distinction of being the first monument built dedicated to world peace. It's also credited with being the first structure in North America to be designed as earthquake resistant. Built of concrete and reinforced steel, the arch stands 20 meters high, 17 meters wide, and is built on a diagonal so that each one pylon sits in each country. Full of architectural symbolism, it's based on the classic Doric order. The arch, as well as the moldings and ornamentation, are overscaled as they're meant to be viewed from a distance. Painted white to symbolize peace, details speak to the peaceful relations between 2 countries, including the inscriptions, children of a common mother on top of the American side, and brethren dwelling together in unity on the Canadian side. Iron gates, fixed in the open position, bear these inscriptions. On one side, may these gates never be closed, and on the other, open 100 years, 1914. With flags flying atop spruce flagstaffs, each over 7 meters high, here it stands, doing its job of reminding us the possibilities of a peaceful world. While the ornamental gates in the arch remain open, unfortunately, due to the worldwide pandemic, the border is basically closed, as is the BC Provincial Park, which would have normally allowed visitors to enjoy this historic area on the Canadian side. Closure of the border made my research more challenging, since a good portion of the resources on the history of the Peace Arch are in institutions in the United States, which I would have loved to have visited for in-person research. However, with a little ingenuity, I was able to make an important contact with someone from Blaine. Christina Winkler is the president of the International Peace Arch Association, which was founded to connect the international community to the history of the Arch and its mission of peace. I knew I'd want to talk with her about her role as a force behind so many activities and events that have taken place in the park over the last several years. My thanks go out to Surrey Historical member Del Sutton, who lives very near the park, overlooks the arch, the gardens, and the water, and she'd participated in many of Christina's events, so she arranged us to have a meeting just a few steps inside the Washington State Park on a chilly afternoon for a couple hours of research, COVID style. The plaque we were standing by on the international boundary was created by the Washington State Historical Society in recognition of the centennial of the Oregon Treaty of 1846, and was erected jointly by our two countries in recognition of an unfortified border. The Oregon Treaty set the boundary between England and the United States from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. This commemorative publication, which you see in the photo, was linked to a celebration of this treaty. On June 15th, 1946, 5,000 Canadians and U.S. citizens gathered at the International Peace Arch. Speakers pleaded for international peace, and veterans of both world wars participating. Canadians marching south through the Arch into America, and the Americans coming north into Canada. The International Boundary Commission is a permanent caretaker of the entire Canada-U.S. boundary and immediate area, ensuring that the boundary is safe and secure, open for tourism and trade. The Commission celebrated its centennial at the Arch in 2008. The Peace Arch is unique in that it's listed on the National Historic Register in 2 countries. It's also unique because it's dedicated simply to peace, as opposed to war heroes, victories, or the war dead. Maintenance and restoration are a shared responsibility between the state of Washington and BC. September 6th of this year was planned to be a centennial celebration of the original dedication ceremony, but sadly has been delayed because of the pandemic. But it's interesting to note that the original construction and dedication of the arch were also delayed, not only by the First World War, but also the pandemic of 1918. The arch was built in commemoration of the centennial of the Treaty of Ghent, signed in what is now Belgium, Christmas Eve, 1814, to end the War of 1812, restoring pre-war borders in North America and stating there shall be no guns, no forts, or man-made barriers along this border. Even though construction of the arch had not begun, there was a centennial celebration of the ratification of the treaty. On July 4th, 1915, it was reported that over 3,000 people gathered around a platform on the boundary line near Blaine to celebrate not only the treaty, but the linking of the 2 countries by the Pacific Highway. Even though large sections of the highway were unfinished, the Pacific Highway Association president, Samuel Hill, presented a keynote address. As a master of ceremonies, he introduced a series of speakers who linked peace with the construction of good roads and highways. An autocade of 300 automobiles parked along the roads and the boundary, and Blaine City Council, aware of Hill's project, established a route through the city. They started by blasting stumps, draining swampland in order to create 5.5 miles of roadway with gravel in time for the celebration. The acts of nations rising each other's flags and bands playing national anthems began the tradition of hundreds of celebrations to follow. At this event, a motion was made that the Canadian and American governments be requested to build a marble arch, properly inscribed, to commemorate 100 years of peace. Thousands cheered, symbolically carrying that motion. This peace celebration was darkened by the fact the world was at war. Canada was already engaged, with the U.S. entering the war in 1917. This dream of an arch dedicated to world peace became the mission of Samuel Hill. He urged governments of both countries to sponsor a monument, but it's unknown how much they actually contributed. It's not disputed that it was his tireless efforts and his generous donations of time and money that made the dream become a reality. Who was Samuel Hill? Nothing to do with that slang expression, "What in the Sam Hill is that?" By all accounts, he was a rare and remarkable man. He was a man of vision, a lover of peace. He was a famed lawyer, financier, advocate of good roads and highways, and a humanitarian. He was born in 1857 into a Quaker family in North Carolina, whose ancestors came to America with the Quaker William Penn. And after an impressive university education, he began a law career in Minneapolis. After a number of successful lawsuits against the Great Northern Railway, he was hired by James J. Hill, empire builder of the Great Northern Railway. He married James Hill's daughter, Mary, one of 7 daughters, and they moved to Seattle. But his relationship with both his wife and his father-in-law became rocky around 1900 and ended in a traumatic divorce with Mary. She moved her 2 children to Minneapolis. When Seattle was his base, he was traveling the world as a wealthy man. He had major interests in Seattle Gas and Electric Company and a number of other lucrative ventures, and allegedly took on a series of mistresses. His passion for world peace, railways, and good roads proved to be the catalyst for what he called a peace portal. He was one of the organizers of Washington's Good Roads Association in 1899. This small group of influential men met annually and lobbied for a state highway system. As the group's biggest booster, he proclaimed, "Good roads are more than my hobby, they're my religion." He went on to become president of the Pacific Highway Association in 1910 and initiated a countrywide system of paved roads in the United States. His travel included countless trips to Europe and Japan, befriending royalty and dignitaries, including Albert, the Crown Prince of Belgium, and Queen Marie, the Queen of Romania. Many of his business dealings took him to Victoria, where he became friends with the former mayor Bert Todd. And apparently during a visit of 1915, the idea of a peace portal began to take shape. Because of the interruption of the war, it wasn't until 1919 that the exact site was chosen by the Pacific Highway Association. The site was chosen for the arch was on the international boundary at Douglas by way of an unpaved road in poor condition. Half the site was donated by the city of Blaine. The other half was a gift from the province of British Columbia with the support of the municipality of Surrey. Even though the Pacific Highway was located 1 mile east at what became Pacific Border Crossing, Hill wanted his arch at Douglas. He wanted it to be close to access by rail and water. Somewhat controversial location, opposed to the landowners of adjacent properties, which included that St. Leonard Hotel, a business with a number of dubious distinctions. After the dedication of the Peace Arch and the opening of the Peace Portal Golf Course in 1931, Douglas became the premier port of entry, and increased traffic resulted in the opening of the Peace Arch Highway, which was renamed King George VI Highway after the royal visit of 1939. The surrounding properties were not finally cleared till the 1930s with the creation of the International Park, which straddles the boundary. With various ideas of how to fund the project, construction began. Hill relied on donations from friends and volunteers and his own private funds. His supporters from both nations donated their services and building supplies. There's no known public record of the accounting of expenses for the construction, although it's been estimated at around $260,000. The design for the arch was donated by the famed American architect Harvey Wiley Corbett. Curiously, no plans for the structure have ever been found. Corbett trained in Paris, designed buildings in London. In America, he's remembered for a number of skyscrapers in New York, and he was one of 3 teams of architects which designed Rockefeller Center. Construction began in early 1920. The footwalls of reinforced concrete were built on 14-inch wooden pilings driven 25 to 30 feet in the ground and topped with a concrete slab. 800 cubic yards of concrete, 50 tons of steel went into the arch, with 3,000 sacks of cement donated by R.P. Bouchard of Victoria. E.H. Gary of New York donated the steel. Construction was under the supervision of H.W. Bassett, an American living in Victoria. The structure was left until the following spring to allow the concrete to set, and 470 electric lights were added a few months before the dedication. The lights proved inconvenient and were replaced later with floodlights. Little is known about the persons directly involved in the construction of the arch. A Seattle engineer was hired to supervise an international workforce of volunteers. There are conflicting claims of whether or not cars ever passed through the 19-foot opening of the arch. Drawings showed an unpaved road branching around the arch, so perhaps these photographs of cars in the arch are staged. An important aspect of the monuments are the artifacts and relics encased in the pillars. These included sections of 2 historic ships. Behind the molded bronze plaques and encased in metal vaults were pieces of the Mayflower, which set sail from Plymouth, England in 1620, with 120 pilgrims bound for the New World. The SS Beaver was owned and operated by the Hudson's Bay Company and was the first steamship to operate on the Pacific coast. The Beaver became snagged in the rocks off Stanley Park in 1888, finally sunk in 1892, and the salvaged relic of the ship was donated by Captain John Irving of Victoria. The story surrounding the Mayflower relic is an example of a story that's a bit difficult to verify. History states that in February 1921, Samuel Hill traveled to the village of Jordans, a Quaker community in Buckinghamshire, where remnants of the Mayflower were believed to have been used in the construction of a barn. It's known that the Mayflower had been broken up on the Thames in 1624, and salvaged timbers probably were used in construction. While the barn in question was built with ship timbers, it's hard to prove that it was the ship that carried the Pilgrims to America. The story surrounding Hill's visit and the receipt of the relic was reported in the Times of London, stating that a member of the British Society of Friends presented to a representative of the American Society of Friends, Samuel Hill, a piece of a timber from a ship assumed to be the Mayflower. He was accompanied on this journey by other members of the Pacific Highway Association, as well as the High Commissioner for British Columbia. The relic was packed in an old Elizabethan strongbox. After the presentation, Mr. Hill stated, "It wasn't a formal affair. We do things first. We tell the government afterwards." It's been claimed that the relic was later set in a casket of hammered steel captured from an African slave ship. This fact seems to lack verification. The laying of the cornerstone was part of the formal dedication ceremony of the arch, located in the facade of the northeast wall above the foundation with the letters 3 inches tall, engraved Pacific Highway 1920. The date was left even though the dedication had been delayed a year. Behind it was installed a sealed copper time capsule to be opened September 6, 2021, said to contain a leather-bound book with copies of treaties pertaining to the border and enduring peace. Also from both countries, copies of newspapers, maps, photos, stamps, coins, and other memorabilia. A silent documentary film produced by Hill entitled The Sacred Scrap of Paper, which depicts the signing of the Treaty of Ghent and other themes significant to his vision of peace, was also deposited somewhere in the arch. September 6, 1921 was indeed a monumental day, following 4 days of celebration in Blaine and a night when the arch was emblazoned with flashing lights. The Princess Patricia had steamed into Blaine from Victoria, carrying hundreds of passengers, including Premier John Oliver. A 6-coach train pulled into Blaine from Vancouver. Motorists choked the roads. Flags of 4 nations, France, Belgium, England, and United States, flew on top of the arch that day. A platform draped in flags was constructed on the southwest corner of the monument, and a wonderphone system of loudspeakers mounted on power poles was installed so the audience could hear the speeches. Beginning at 2 p.m., Samuel Hill was the master of ceremonies, addressing a crowd of 15,000 people. Hill had sent cables around the world hoping leaders and dignitaries would attend. Since he'd met so many of them and was presented himself with medals of appreciation for his dedication and ingenuity in road building, he must have been disappointed that most sent replies of not being able to attend. The ceremonies ended with a message of appreciation from U.S. President Warren Harding, which was read to the crowd by Hill. Band concerts continued in Blaine, with fireworks ending the day. As in the celebration of 1915, there was exchange of flags and bands played national anthems. This would not be the last dedication ceremony at the Arch. The following March, General Joffre of France dedicated the Arch a second time. And in 1926, Queen Marie of Romania, on a trip to North America, dedicated it yet again. In her diary, the Queen described the arch as a weird construction. The idea is fine, but it's without beauty or dignity, she said. She also wrote that Sam was sometimes a bit scatterbrained in some of his worldwide schemes. Jumping ahead in my timeline, the relics inside the arch sadly did not withstand the damage of rainwater seeping in through the concrete. In 1985, it was discovered the water had caused significant damage, a bit like a leaky condo. The protective sealed lead containers containing the ship's relics had corroded, causing severe damage to both artifacts. The Canadian piece was sent to the Canadian Conservation Institute and is now stored at the Vancouver Maritime Museum. The Mayflower relic was restored at the Smithsonian Institute and is held by the Washington State Parks in a central collections facility. A major restoration of the arch was completed in 1993. With the cooperation of both Washington State and BC officials, crews began the mammoth task of reviving the arch. The accumulation of 3 feet of water in each of the pillars was discovered. The trapped water had begun to seep through its concrete walls, forcing the paint to bubble. In addition to removing the trapped water, a drainage system was installed before the structure was sandblasted, the roof resurfaced, and the application of a weatherproof coating before being repainted. The arch was again under wraps last summer for a fresh coat of paint and restoration of gates and plaques. The park area surrounding the arch is unique because it's 2 parks in 2 countries, 43 acres, 20 in Canada, 23 in the US. Even though some improvements had been made in time of the dedication, the arch was hardly sitting in an impressive landscape. The grounds on the Canadian side definitely needed improvement. The BC government had granted Surrey powers to expropriate lands if necessary, but there were a number of issues that caused delays on both sides of the arch. So it wasn't until the 1930s that the parks were actually created. British Columbia school children began to raise funds in support of the Canadian park. The British Columbia Boys and Girls Peace League was organized in 1922 with membership going towards the creation of gardens around the arch. Children under 12 gave 10 cents and were presented with a certificate. The goal was to encourage every child in the province to join, have their names inscribed on a scroll to be later deposited somewhere inside the arch. A similar program of fundraising through school children ran in Washington. The certificate you see in the photo was granted to a child named Alice Johnson, March 1st, 1922, proving her membership in British Columbia Boys and Girls Peace League. Advertised through the Vancouver Sun, and even though the response was phenomenal, progress was still slow. It wasn't until 1939, with the help of men from Green Timbers Relief Camp and the hiring of John Booth as a landscaper, that the Canadian side was completed. With a total of 43 acres, the parks are generally known for their beautifully landscaped gardens, magnificent vistas, and the open border. Throughout the park, there are historic buildings, plaques, and cairns. There's a recent addition I would like to bring to your attention. In September 2018, an historic wrong was addressed at a ceremonial rising of the restored grizzly bear pole inside the Peace Arch Park. This replica of a traditional Haida pole had been situated at the old visitors' centers just north of the border, but it had been ripped out and cast aside during the building of the new facility. In closing off this section, I want to mention that both parks were threatened in the 1990s when both federal governments were planning expansions to their border crossing facilities. It was the dedicated efforts of grassroots organizers that convinced governments to shift their proposed plans, which would have intruded into the park. Over the years, this has been the setting of countless programs ranging from celebrations, memorials, and protests that attract thousands, down to family reunions, simple weddings, and family picnics. It's the setting of countless charity events, exhibitions, and awareness campaigns. Rick Hansen paused at the Arch as he began his 25,000-mile journey around the world. Perhaps the most well-known is the annual celebration, Hands Across the Border event, which began in 1937. This annual event, usually held on the second Sunday in June, is when Canadian youth groups gather in huge crowds to celebrate close ties between nations. A parade of flags from around the world are carried through the Arch, and children typically exchange badges and pins. On a somber note, memorial ceremonies were held following the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 and the death of Winston Churchill in 1965. Perhaps the most moving memorial took place a few days after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Responding to the horror and the trauma of the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York, the Peace Arch Association organized a vigil and candle lighting ceremony at the Arch the following Saturday evening. Memorials at the Peace Arch in honor of lives lost during the attack continue on each anniversary as people gather on each side of the border to pay tribute to the innocent victims and the bravery and heroism of the first responders. It was in the 1950s that the Peace Arch was the setting of a series of concerts which shined a light on racial injustice and political oppression. Famed U.S. singer, actor, and activist Paul Robeson was blacklisted by his own government during McCarthyism and the anti-communist era. His passport was revoked in 1950. His successful international career was ended. He was no longer able to perform in the United States, nor find recording studios to work with him. In January of 1952, he planned to perform at the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers at their conference in Vancouver. Since at the time no passport was needed to visit Canada, he accepted. On learning of his visit, the U.S. State Department evoked a law passed during the war years to block his visit on grounds that in a national emergency, citizens could be stopped from leaving or entering the country, and the emergency in this case was deemed to be the Cold War. Federal officers boarded his train in Blaine, and he was forced to return to Seattle, where through a long-distance telephone call relayed through a PA system, he addressed and sang for 2,000 delegates at the convention. This inspired a motion that Robeson performed at a cross-the-border concert at the Peace Arch Crossing. So on May 18th, 1952, Paul Robeson stood on the back of a platform truck on the American side, sang to an estimated crowd of 30,000 Canadians and 5,000 Americans.
So that you must understand this, they will hear about this today. They will hear about our gathering here. This will mean a great deal to see that many of us may be able to travel in the future. And why do they take my passport away? They have said so in a case. They put it in a brief. They said that no matter what my political beliefs, what my standing among the Negro people of my own land in America, but they would have to take my passport away anyhow, because out of my own lips, mind you, from my own lips, for many years, I have been struggling for the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa, and that is meddling in the foreign affairs of the United States government. Now, that's just too bad, because I'm going to have to continue to meddle.
Three more Peace Arch concerts followed. 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled no citizen could be denied a passport because of their political beliefs. His passport was returned. He resumed international concerts and speeches in support of freedom of speech and civil rights. Although he never returned to the Peace Arch, a memorial concert was held in the park on May 18, 2002, 50 years after his first concert. On a lighter note, I want to end this look at parks with the Olympic torch run of 2010. In 2009, Canada signed on to new rules of the Olympic Organizing Committee that torch relays could only take place in host countries. This rule was only bent a little when U.S. gold medalist Phil Mayer perhaps ran 100 footsteps into his home country before crossing back through the arch into Canada. In looking back over the history of the Peace Arch, it seems like a time we should reflect on the accomplishments of the man who imagined both the monument and a dream of world peace. In 1922, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution expressing appreciation to Sam Hill on the building and the dedication of the Peace Arch, and in 1936, the Washington Good Roads Association added a plaque to the front of the arch in commemoration of the life and works of Samuel Hill. This was after his death in 1931. Unfortunately, I think it's fair to say he's not a familiar historic figure to most, and during the ensuing years of what seemed like perpetual wars, the dream of world peace seems all but forgotten. The closing of the land border has resulted in hardship and loneliness for so many family and friends being separated. I look forward to the day when this separation is over. I also look forward to the spectacular centennial celebrations, now only paused, to once again remind us and cherish peaceful relations between our two countries. Thank you.